The construction began on June 14, 1889, and by noon, the temperature had reached 104 degrees in the shade that didn't exist on Clara Hutchins' empty quarter section claim 3 miles southeast of Prescott, Arizona Territory. By evening, half the town had ridden out to watch the 19-year-old girl dig mud from the arroyo behind her property line, and by the following Sunday, the pastor at First Methodist was using her as an example of prideful foolishness in his sermon. She had been thrown out of her stepfather's house with $250 in coins her mother had hidden in a flour tin, a mule named Democrat, and instructions never to return. The town expected her to fail within a month, marry out of desperation within 2, or disappear into one of the territorial brothels within 3. Instead, she purchased 40 acres of hardpan and rock that nobody wanted, filed her claim at the land office with a penmanship that surprised the clerk, and began building a house out of mud. The neighbors called it insanity. Clara called it mathematics. She had spent the first 11 years of her life in Santa Fe, where her father worked as a surveyor for the territorial government before dying of typhoid when she was 12. Her mother remarried within a year to a mining engineer named Howard Garrett, who moved them to Prescott and treated Clara with a tolerance that evaporated the moment her mother died of childbed fever 3 weeks after Clara's 19th birthday. The baby died too. Garrett gave Clara 3 days to pack what she could carry and leave. He kept her mother's things, the house, everything, except the money Clara's mother had apparently been saving for years in amounts small enough that Garrett never noticed. $250 in silver and gold coins wrapped in a piece of muslin with Clara's name embroidered on it. It wasn't enough to rent a room indefinitely, and Clara had no skills that would earn enough to matter in a town where women's work paid $3 a week. But she had memories of Santa Fe, of thick-walled adobe houses that stayed cool when the summer heat made the air shimmer, and she had her father's surveying notebooks, which she'd saved. In the back of the third notebook, her father had written extensive calculations about thermal mass, heat absorption, and the specific properties of adobe construction. He'd measured everything: wall thickness, interior temperatures, exterior temperatures, the rate of heat transfer through different materials. Her father had measured the world and written down what he found, and now Clara had 40 acres, $250, and his notebooks. The land cost her $12 at auction. Nobody else bid. It had no water except the seasonal arroyo, no timber, no obvious mineralization, and soil so alkaline that sagebrush barely survived. But it had clay. The arroyo cut through a layer of clay that ran 8 feet deep in places, and Clara spent the first week digging test samples, mixing them with sand and straw in different proportions, forming bricks, and letting them dry in the sun. She was testing for strength and cracking patterns. The optimal mixture, according to her father's notes from Santa Fe, was approximately 60% clay, 30% sand, and 10% straw by volume, with enough water to make the mixture barely pliable. Too wet, and the bricks would crack as they dried. Too dry, and they wouldn't hold together. She made 30 test bricks in different ratios, numbered them with a stick while they were wet, and arranged them in a row to cure. Then she lived under a canvas tarp, stretched between 4 posts, while she waited for the results and planned her structure. Thomas Wardell owned the neighboring section to the north, running 15 head of cattle on land that barely supported 5. He was 42 years old, had survived the war and 2 Apache raids, and knew the territory as well as any white man living. He rode out on the 3rd day of Clara's occupation to explain reality. "Miss Hutchins," he said, sitting his horse in the shade of her canvas while she sketched plans in the dirt with a mesquite stick. "You cannot build a house out of mud bricks. The summer rains will melt it back to the ground before autumn." He was not being cruel. He had 3 daughters himself, and Clara's situation troubled him. Adobe works in Santa Fe because they get different rain. Here, we get the monsoons, 2 inches in an hour, straight down like God dumping a bucket. Your mud house will dissolve. Clara looked up from her sketches. "How thick were the adobe walls you've seen?" she asked. Wardell considered. "Standard thickness, 8 inches, maybe 10. Clara nodded. "Mine will be 32 inches thick at the base, tapering to 24 inches at the roof line, and they'll have a fired clay cap and lime plaster coating. The rain will run off, not soak in." Wardell frowned. "That's an enormous amount of material for a girl working alone. How many bricks do you calculate you'll need?" Clara had already done the mathematics. For a single-room structure measuring 14 feet by 16 feet interior dimension, with walls averaging 28 inches thick and 8 feet high, approximately 3,200 bricks, each measuring 10 inches by 14 inches by 4 inches. At my current production rate of 40 bricks per day, that's 80 days of work, not counting drying time or construction time. She said this while continuing to sketch, her voice matter of fact. Wardell stared at her. "You figured that in your head?" Clara shook her head. "I figured it over the past week. I'm just remembering it now." Margaret Chen ran the general store in Prescott with her husband William. She was the first person Clara approached about purchasing lime for plaster, and she was the person who spread the word about the mud house through every conversation in her store for the next month. "That Hutchins girl is planning to make 3,000 mud bricks," she told customers with a mixture of fascination and concern. "She's living out there under a tarp like a field hand, digging clay, and she's got notebooks full of calculations. I sold her 70 pounds of straw and she paid in coin, counted it out exact. Didn't try to negotiate, didn't ask for credit, just paid and loaded it on that mule of hers." Margaret was not unkind, but she was practical, and she didn't believe the project would succeed. She told her husband, "That girl will be begging for work before the 4th of July, and we should be prepared to offer her something. Stocking shelves, maybe. She can read and do figures." William Chen agreed. They gave Clara 3 weeks before desperation set in. Father Diego Campos from the Catholic Mission rode out on horseback in late June, having heard about Clara's project from members of his congregation who found the whole situation disturbing. A young Anglo girl building an adobe house like a Mexican peasant, living alone in the desert, refusing all offers of help or charity. He found her making bricks in wooden forms she'd built from scrap lumber purchased in town. She had a system: mix the clay, sand, and straw in a depression she dug and lined with canvas. Add water from the arroyo, brought up in buckets. Mix it with her feet until the consistency was uniform. Pack the mixture into rectangular wooden forms. Strike it level with a board. Turn out the wet brick onto level ground to dry. She was working barefoot in the mud, her skirts tied up, a wide hat shading her face, and she did not stop when Father Campos arrived. "Miss Hutchins," he said in English, though he was more comfortable in Spanish. "I've come to offer assistance. The church has funds for those in difficult circumstances." Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read: gratitude, irritation. "Father, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not in difficult circumstances. I'm building a house. Unless the church wants to purchase bricks, I don't need assistance." Father Campos tried again. "Child, this is not work for a young woman alone. An adobe construction requires knowledge of techniques that—" Clara interrupted him, still working. "I know the techniques. My father documented them extensively, and I'm not a child. I'm a property owner and a homesteader. If the church is concerned about my soul, I'll attend Mass when I have time. Right now, I have 73 bricks to make before the heat gets unbearable." Father Campos blessed her and left, troubled but also slightly impressed. The bricks cured in the sun for 2 weeks, during which Clara built the foundation. She dug a trench 18 inches deep, following the outline she'd marked with stakes and string, making sure the corners were perfectly square by measuring the diagonals until they matched. Then she filled the trench with rocks from her property, tamping them down and filling the gaps with smaller stones and gravel until she had a solid base that sat 4 inches above the surrounding ground level. This was crucial. Adobe's greatest enemy was moisture wicking up from the ground. The rock foundation would prevent that, and the finished floor would sit above the base, separated by a layer of sand for drainage. Her father's notebooks were explicit about this. Every failed adobe structure he'd examined had failed because of moisture from below, not rain from above. If you kept adobe dry at its base and protected at its top, it would last for centuries. The Spanish had proven this throughout the Southwest. The Pueblo people had proven it for even longer. But Americans building in the territory kept trying to use their Eastern construction methods, and they kept failing, and then they blamed the material instead of their own ignorance. If you value these stories of practical innovation and forgotten wisdom, subscribe to this channel. There are hundreds of these accounts buried in territorial newspapers and land office records, examples of people who solve problems with careful thought instead of conventional assumptions, and most of them have been completely forgotten. A subscription helps preserve and share this knowledge. It's a small thing that matters. By mid-July, Clara began laying bricks. She made mortar from the same clay mixture, just wetter, and she laid each course with a level she'd borrowed from Thomas Wardell, who had ridden over again to watch this phase of construction with undisguised skepticism. "Those walls are going to be heavy," he observed. "You'll need substantial roof support." Clara nodded, pointing to a stack of pine logs she'd purchased from a timber outfit that had delivered them 2 days earlier. Ridge beam and 4 support posts, all pine, 8 inches diameter minimum. The roof will be pine lattice covered with canvas, then 6 inches of earth on top of the canvas. Total roof weight approximately 4,800 pounds, distributed across the wall perimeter and the 4 interior posts. Wardell shook his head slowly. "You're building a fortress to keep out summer heat." Clara placed another brick, tapped it level, and reached for the next one. "I'm building a structure that maintains a stable interior temperature regardless of exterior conditions. That's not a fortress. That's just good design." The walls rose slowly. Clara worked in the early morning from first light until about 10 o'clock, when the heat became dangerous. Then she rested in the shade of the canvas tarp until late afternoon, working again from about 5 o'clock until dark. She was building alone, lifting bricks that weighed 12 pounds each, laying them in a running bond pattern that distributed stress and created structural stability. By the end of July, the walls were 4 feet high. By mid-August, they'd reached 6 feet. The work was brutal. Her hands developed calluses on top of calluses. She lost weight she didn't have to lose, but the walls were rising, perfectly plumb, perfectly level, and the thickness was already demonstrating thermal properties that Clara noted with satisfaction. When the exterior surface of the wall reached 120 degrees in direct afternoon sun, the interior surface remained below 85 degrees. The 28 inches of adobe was absorbing heat so slowly that the interior lagged behind exterior conditions by hours. This was the principle: thermal mass. The thick walls would absorb heat during the day so slowly that the interior remained cool. At night, when the desert temperature dropped, the walls would release that heat to the exterior while the interior stayed warm. The result would be a stable temperature that varied by only a few degrees, regardless of what happened outside. Samuel and Ruth Baxter ran a dry goods operation and owned a house in Prescott proper, a wood frame structure with clapboard siding painted white, built in the style Samuel remembered from Ohio. They were respectable people, active in the Methodist Church, and they considered the whole Clara Hutchins situation to be a tragedy that reflected poorly on Howard Garrett, who still attended services despite having thrown out his stepdaughter. Ruth Baxter organized a delegation of 3 church women to visit Clara in early August with a basket of food and an offer of respectable employment as a domestic servant in the Baxter household. They arrived to find Clara on top of her wall, 6 feet off the ground, laying bricks on the 7th course. She climbed down to receive them, dusty and sunburned and polite. Ruth Baxter made her offer. "Clara, dear, you've proven you're a hard worker. No one questions that. But this project is too much for a young woman alone, and it's not proper besides. Mr. Baxter and I would like to offer you employment. Room, board, and $4 a week. You'd help me with the household and assist in the store when needed. It's respectable work." Clara thanked her and declined. "Mrs. Baxter, I appreciate the offer, but I have work here. I'm about 2 weeks from finishing the walls, and then I'll install the roof structure. I should be enclosed before the monsoons start in earnest." Ruth Baxter looked at the thick mud walls rising from the desert hardpan. "And then what? You'll live here alone? That's not a life for a young woman. You need a husband, a family, a place in society." Clara's expression was patient. "I need a house. Once I have that, I'll consider what comes next." The delegation left unsatisfied, and Ruth Baxter told the church ladies that Clara Hutchins was stubborn to the point of self-destruction. "She'll fail," Ruth said with certainty, "and when she does, we'll help her. But she has to learn this lesson herself." The general consensus in Prescott was that Clara's project would either collapse structurally or prove uninhabitable, and either way, she'd be forced to abandon it and accept charity or employment. The few Mexicans in town who'd actually seen the construction thought otherwise. Juan Morales, who did carpentry work throughout the territory, rode out to look at Clara's walls and came back shaking his head in admiration. "She's building it correctly," he told anyone who would listen. Thick walls, good foundation, proper techniques. That house will be standing in 100 years. But Juan Morales was not part of the social structure that made decisions about respectability and proper behavior, so his opinion didn't change the prevailing judgment. Clara finished the walls on August 18th, 8 feet high, varying from 32 inches thick at the base to 24 inches at the top, with the courses stepped back slightly to create the taper. She'd installed wooden lintels above the door opening on the south wall and 2 window openings, one on the east wall and one on the west, positioned to create cross ventilation. The windows were small, only 24 inches square, because large windows would allow heat transfer that would defeat the purpose of the thick walls. She'd purchased real glass panes for the windows, 8 small panes per window in wooden frames she built herself, and they cost her $32 total, which was extravagant but necessary. Then she installed the roof structure. The 4 interior posts were set in holes dug 3 feet deep and backfilled with tamped earth and rocks. They rose to a height of 9 feet, supporting a ridge beam that ran the length of the structure. From the ridge beam and the tops of the walls, she laid pine lattice at 18-inch intervals, creating a framework. Over this, she stretched canvas, overlapping the seams and tacking it securely. Then came the critical part. She hauled earth onto the roof, 6 inches deep across the entire surface, sloping slightly toward the edges for drainage. This added tremendous weight, but it also added thermal mass. The earth layer would insulate the interior from direct sun on the roof, and it would absorb and release heat on the same delayed cycle as the walls. Finally, she built a parapet wall around the roof edge, 8 inches high, to keep the earth layer in place and to provide additional protection from rain. The total cost of materials so far, $247, leaving her $3 for furnishings and supplies. The first significant test came on August 24th. Clara had moved inside the day before, even though the structure wasn't completely finished. She still needed to plaster the interior walls and build a proper door, but the roof was on and the windows were in, and she'd spent her first night inside on a bedroll on the dirt floor. The temperature that day reached 108 degrees by 2 in the afternoon, and inside Clara's adobe house, with both windows open to create cross ventilation, the temperature reached 74 degrees. She measured it with a thermometer she'd purchased specifically for this purpose, hanging it on the interior of the north wall where it wouldn't be affected by direct sunlight through the windows. At the same time, Thomas Wardell's wood frame ranch house 3/4 of a mile north was 96 degrees inside despite all windows and doors being open. Wardell's wife, Emma, had taken their daughters to the creek to escape the heat. In Prescott, the interior of most buildings hovered around 95 to 100 degrees, and people did their best to endure. Clara sat inside her adobe house in relative comfort, mixing lime plaster for the interior walls. The plaster served 2 purposes. It sealed the adobe against any moisture penetration, and it created a lighter colored surface that would reflect interior light, making the space more livable. She mixed the plaster from lime, sand, and water, adding a small amount of cactus juice for adhesion, a technique she'd read about in her father's notes. Then she applied it to the walls in a thin, smooth coat, working section by section. Thomas Wardell rode over that evening to check on Clara and found her plastering by lamplight, the interior of her house noticeably cooler than the outside air. He stood in the doorway and felt the temperature difference. "How cool is it in here?" he asked. Clara gestured to the thermometer. 74 degrees at the peak of the afternoon. It's about 71 now. Wardell stepped inside and stood there, feeling the thick walls radiate a gentle coolness. "This actually works," he said, and there was surprise in his voice despite having watched the entire construction process. Clara continued, plastering. "It's physics, Mr. Wardell. Thermal mass delays heat transfer. The thicker the mass, the longer the delay. With 28-inch walls, the delay is approximately 12 hours. So the interior experiences yesterday's nighttime temperature during today's afternoon, and vice versa. Since the desert cools significantly at night, the average interior temperature stays well below the peak exterior temperature." Wardell nodded slowly. "And in winter?" Clara had thought about this. "In winter, the same principle keeps the interior warmer than outside. I'll heat the space with a small fire, and the walls will absorb and hold that heat, releasing it slowly overnight. I should be able to maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel." Wardell touched the plastered wall, feeling its solidity. "How much did this cost you?" Clara wiped plaster from her hands. $247 for all materials, including the land. I did all the labor myself. Wardell let out a low whistle. My house cost $800 to build, and it's barely habitable in summer. He looked around the single room, 14 by 16 feet, with its thick walls and small windows and earth-covered roof. You might be the smartest person in this territory, Miss Hutchins. September brought the monsoons, and the skeptics waited for vindication. Adobe couldn't survive the downpours, they insisted. Margaret Chen told her customers, "We'll see how that mud house holds up when the real rain comes. I give it one good storm before it starts melting." The first monsoon arrived on September 7th, dropping 1.8 inches of rain in 90 minutes. The deluge turned the desert into temporary streams, and the arroyo behind Clara's property ran 4 feet deep with brown water. Clara sat inside her house, dry and comfortable, listening to the rain hammer the earth-covered roof and watching water sheet off the lime-plastered exterior walls without penetrating. The parapet and the roof slope directed water away from the walls. The foundation kept moisture from wicking up. The house shed water like it was designed to do, because it was designed to do exactly that. When the rain stopped and the sun returned, Clara walked around the exterior examining the walls carefully. There was no erosion, no softening, no damage at all. The lime plaster had done its job. 2 days later, another storm dropped 2 inches in an hour. Same result. By the end of September, after 6 significant monsoons, Clara's house showed no weather damage whatsoever, and the critics in town began to quiet down. October was pleasant, with warm days and cool nights, and Clara's house maintained a steady interior temperature between 68 and 72 degrees with no heating or cooling effort required. She built simple furniture from scrap lumber, installed a proper door with hinges and a lock, and began the process of proving up her homestead claim. She needed to live on the property for 5 years and make improvements, which she was clearly doing. She also needed income, and she found it by offering surveying services. Her father had taught her how to use his instruments before he died, and she still had his transit and measuring chains. The territorial government needed surveyors for the ongoing project of mapping land grants and mineral claims, and Clara's work was precise and reliable. She began getting hired for small jobs, then larger ones. By November, she was earning enough to buy supplies and begin saving money again. The people who hired her didn't care that she was a 19-year-old woman living alone in a mud house. They cared that her surveys were accurate and her reports were clear. The work took her away from her property for days at a time, but the house sat secure and untouched, which was more than could be said for canvas and wood structures that could be dismantled or damaged. If this kind of practical innovation interests you, consider liking this video. These stories don't circulate in conventional history because they're not dramatic enough for the history books, but they represent real solutions to real problems, and the principles are often still relevant. Your engagement helps these accounts reach people who can use them. Winter in the Arizona high desert is cold, not Montana cold, but cold enough to matter. December and January see nighttime temperatures below freezing regularly, and daytime temperatures that struggle to reach 50 degrees. In Prescott, people burned wood and coal to heat their houses, and the combination of poor insulation and drafty construction meant that staying warm was expensive and difficult. Clara heated her adobe house with a small corner fireplace she'd built during November, using fired brick for the firebox and a clay chimney that rose through the roof. The fireplace was modest, designed to burn small fires efficiently rather than large fires wastefully. She'd positioned it in the northeast corner, so the thermal mass of the walls would absorb and distribute the heat. On the coldest night of that winter, January 11th, 1890, when the temperature outside dropped to 19 degrees, Clara burned a fire from 6 in the evening until 10 o'clock, using approximately 15 pounds of mesquite wood. By midnight, the fire was out, and the interior temperature was 64 degrees. By dawn, it had dropped to 61 degrees, while the exterior temperature was 22 degrees. The thick walls had absorbed heat from the fire and were releasing it slowly, keeping the interior warm. Clara used less than 1/3 the fuel of her neighbors and maintained more comfortable temperatures. The mathematics were working in her favor. Thomas Wardell brought his family to visit on a Sunday afternoon. in January, ostensibly to check on Clara's well-being, but actually to see the house in winter operation. Emma Wardell was a practical woman who'd lived in the territory for 12 years and knew the cost of staying warm. She stood inside Clara's house, feeling the comfortable temperature, noting the small fireplace, and doing calculations in her head. "How much wood do you burn in a week?" she asked Clara. Clara kept records. "In December, I burned approximately 120 pounds of wood per week. That's keeping the interior between 62 and 68 degrees through nights that dropped into the 20s. Emma Wardell's eyes widened. "We burn 400 pounds a week, and our house is cold in the mornings." Clara nodded. "Thick walls. That's the difference. Your house loses heat as fast as you generate it. Mine stores heat and releases it slowly." Emma turned to her husband. "Thomas, we should have built with adobe." Thomas Wardell agreed. "Yes, we should have. But we didn't know. Clara's father knew, and she remembered." He looked at Clara with respect. "What you've done here is remarkable. You took $250 in less than 6 months and created something better than what the rest of us built for much more money. That's not luck. That's knowledge applied correctly." The real test came in late June 1890, when the territory experienced a heat wave that weather records would later confirm as the most extreme on record until that point. The temperature in Prescott reached 110 degrees on June 24th and stayed above 108 for 5 consecutive days. At night, it barely dropped below 85. The heat was dangerous. 2 elderly residents died. Livestock suffered. People soaked sheets in water and hung them in doorways, trying to create evaporative cooling, but the humidity was too low for it to help much. The town essentially shut down during the afternoon hours, with people hiding in cellars or the stone courthouse building, which stayed marginally cooler than wood structures. 3 miles southeast, Clara Hutchins sat inside her adobe house in comfort. The interior temperature on June 24th, at the peak of the heat, reached 68 degrees. She measured it repeatedly because it seemed impossible, but the thermometer was accurate. Outside 110 degrees, inside 68 degrees. The differential was 42 degrees, maintained by nothing but passive thermal mass and intelligent design. She kept the windows closed during the day to prevent hot air from entering, opening them at night when the temperature dropped to create ventilation. The thick walls absorbed the day's heat so slowly that it never reached the interior before nighttime cooling began. The earth-covered roof added another layer of insulation and thermal mass. The small windows minimized heat gain from sunlight. Every element worked together to create an environment that defied the exterior conditions. Word spread. Margaret Chen heard about it from a customer who'd visited Clara to discuss a surveying job and had been astonished by the cool interior. Margaret mentioned it to Ruth Baxter, who mentioned it to her husband Samuel, who decided to see for himself. On June 26th, when Prescott was still baking under 109-degree heat, Samuel Baxter rode out to Clara's property. She was working outside in the early morning, repairing the edge of her roof where some earth had eroded during the spring rains. Baxter dismounted and stood in the sun, already sweating through his shirt despite the early hour. "Miss Hutchins," he said, "I've heard reports that your house remains cool despite this heat. Is that accurate?" Clara climbed down from the roof. "It's 67 degrees inside right now. You're welcome to verify." Baxter stepped through the door and immediately felt the difference. The air inside was not just cooler, but fundamentally different, dry and still and comfortable. He stood there for a long moment, letting his body adjust. "How is this possible?" Clara explained the principles of thermal mass, heat delay, and passive cooling. Baxter listened, and then he said something that surprised her. "Miss Hutchins, would you be willing to consult on a building project? The territorial government is planning a new administrative building in Prescott, and given this heat, I think they should consider adobe construction. I'm on the planning committee. We could pay for your expertise." This was the beginning of Clara's second career. She continued surveying, but she also began consulting on adobe construction, teaching the techniques her father had documented and she had proven. The territorial administrative building was constructed in 1891 using 2-foot-thick adobe walls, and it remained one of the coolest public buildings in Prescott through every subsequent summer. Clara supervised the construction and was paid $150 for her consultation, which was more money than many men in the territory earned in 3 months. Other projects followed: a schoolhouse, a church, several private residences for people who decided that comfort mattered more than conforming to Eastern building styles. Clara trained work crews in proper adobe techniques: the correct mud mixture, the importance of foundation drainage, the necessity of lime plaster protection, the optimal wall thickness for the local climate. She was 20 years old and had become the territory's recognized expert in thermal efficient construction. Father Diego Campos commissioned her to design a new chapel for the mission in 1892, and during their planning meetings, he mentioned something that had been troubling him. "Clara, when I first visited you during your construction, I thought you were being foolish. I'm ashamed of that now. You knew exactly what you were doing, and I should have recognized the legitimacy of your knowledge." Clara was gracious. "Father, you were concerned for my welfare. That's not something to be ashamed of. And besides, I was making bricks in the mud barefoot. I can see how that might have looked foolish to someone unfamiliar with adobe work." Father Campos smiled. "What you've accomplished is remarkable. You've changed how people build in this territory. Do you realize that?" Clara had realized it, but she didn't think it was particularly remarkable. "I just applied techniques that were already proven. The Spanish have been building with adobe for centuries. The Pueblo people for longer than that. I didn't invent anything. I just remembered what worked and used it." Thomas Wardell tore down his wood frame house in 1893 and rebuilt with adobe using techniques he'd learned by watching Clara and asking questions. His new house had 20-inch walls, a traditional pitched roof, rather than a flat, earth-covered roof. He wasn't quite ready to go that far. And proper lime plaster coating. It cost him $400 in materials and took him 4 months to build with help from his sons, who were old enough to do useful work. The first summer in the new house, Emma Wardell told Clara, "I didn't know it was possible to be comfortable in July. I thought summer was just something you survived. Thank you for showing us there was a better way." Clara had been invited for Sunday dinner, and she sat at the Wardells' table in their cool adobe house, feeling something she hadn't felt since her mother died. Part of a family, if only temporarily. The irony was not lost on Clara that Howard Garrett, her stepfather who'd thrown her out, was still living in his wood frame house in Prescott, sweating through every summer and burning through money to stay marginally warm in winter. She occasionally saw him in town and they did not speak, but she heard through the inevitable small-town gossip that he'd been heard saying Clara had gotten lucky, that anyone could build a mud hut. Margaret Chen, who'd once predicted Clara's failure, bristled at this and told Garrett to his face that luck had nothing to do with it. "That girl succeeded through knowledge and hard work," Margaret said in her store with other customers listening. "You should be proud of her instead of bitter." Garrett stopped shopping at the Chen's store after that, which cost him convenience since it was the largest general store in town. But pride is expensive, and he paid the price. By 1895, approximately 30% of new construction in and around Prescott was adobe, a dramatic shift from the almost exclusive wood frame construction of the previous decade. The territorial newspapers noted this change, but attributed it to generic adaptation to local conditions, without mentioning Clara Hutchins by name. She had started the transformation, trained the builders, consulted on the designs, but the innovation became invisible as it became standard. This was fine with Clara. She hadn't built her house for recognition. She'd built it for survival, and it had delivered exactly what she needed: shelter, comfort, and the foundation for independence. If you found this account valuable, please subscribe. The preservation of these stories depends on people who understand that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that the best solutions are sometimes the ones that have been working for centuries, just waiting for someone to remember and apply them properly. Your subscription is a vote for this kind of content. Clara married in 1897 to a surveyor named James Coughlin, who'd worked with her on several territorial projects and had the good sense to appreciate competence when he encountered it. They built a larger adobe house on her original 40-acre claim, and they raised 3 children there. Clara continued surveying and consulting until 1912, when Arizona became a state and the surge of new construction made her services constantly in demand. She was 42 years old and had been working professionally for 22 years, which was longer than most men sustained active careers. She began teaching instead, offering courses in Adobe construction and thermal design at the new Territorial College, and her students went on to build throughout the Southwest. The techniques she taught were not particularly complicated, which was the point. Effective design doesn't require complexity. It requires understanding the principles and applying them rigorously. Clara's father had understood this. She had learned it, and she'd spent her career demonstrating it to anyone willing to pay attention. The original house, the one she built in 1889 for $247, remained standing and occupied for 91 years. Various owners lived there through the decades, most of them unaware of the structure's history or the person who'd built it. They simply knew they had a house that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, that required almost no energy to maintain comfortable temperatures, and that seemed to improve with age as the adobe walls cured and hardened. In 1980, a developer purchased the property intending to demolish the old adobe house and build a modern subdivision. A local historian intervened, having researched the property records and discovered Clara's connection. The house was preserved, restored, and eventually listed on the National Register of Historic Places as an early example of thermally efficient vernacular architecture in the Arizona Territory. The designation mentioned Clara Hutchins by name and included excerpts from her father's surveying notebooks, which she donated to the Territorial Archives before her death in 1954 at the age of 84. Modern, sustainable architecture has rediscovered the principles Clara applied in 1889: thermal mass, passive cooling, earth-integrated design, minimal window area in extreme climates. These are now considered cutting-edge green building techniques, and architects charge substantial fees to implement them. The physics haven't changed. A thick wall of adobe or rammed earth or any dense material will absorb and release heat slowly, creating a thermal buffer between interior and exterior. This worked in 1889, it worked in 1589, it worked in 889, and it works today. The innovation isn't in discovering new principles, but in remembering and applying old ones that were set aside when cheap energy made inefficient construction affordable. As energy costs rise and climate awareness grows, people are building thick-walled, earth-integrated, passively cooled structures again, and they're discovering what Clara knew. The best technology for thermal comfort in extreme climates is often the simplest, the oldest, and the most elegant. The house still stands. Visitors can tour it during certain hours, and they invariably comment on the comfortable interior temperature, regardless of the exterior conditions. The walls are still thick, still doing the job Clara designed them to do more than a century ago. The thermometer, hanging on the interior north wall, a replica of the one Clara used, typically reads between 65 and 70 degrees on summer days when Prescott reaches 105. The differential is smaller now because the modern preservation efforts include climate control to protect artifacts, but even with the windows sealed and no active cooling, the structure naturally maintains temperatures 20 to 30 degrees below exterior peaks. That's not historical curiosity. That's physics, proving itself over and over, indifferent to whether anyone remembers the 19-year-old woman who mixed mud in an arroyo and built a house that made the skeptics wrong. Clara Hutchins died in her sleep in the larger adobe house she and James had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having lived long enough to see adobe construction become standard practice in the Southwest. Her obituary in the Prescott newspaper mentioned her surveying career and her teaching, but it didn't mention the original house or the circumstances of its construction. The editors didn't know the story or didn't think it mattered, but the house knew. It sat 3 miles southeast of town, thick-walled and sturdy and comfortable, doing what Clara had designed it to do, proving every summer and winter that knowledge applied correctly creates value that lasts for generations. She'd been thrown out at 19 with $250 and told implicitly that she would fail. She built a house that stayed 68 degrees while the town sweltered at 110, and in doing so, she changed how an entire region built shelter. The skeptics had been certain she was wrong, right up until the moment the heat proved she was right, and then they'd started building thick walls and small windows and learning the mathematics of thermal mass. That's how knowledge spreads on the frontier, slowly, skeptically, but inevitably, because survival doesn't care about tradition. It cares about what works, and Clara's house worked better than anything else in the territory. Still does.